Hello, everyone. Good evening. We're so delighted that you were able to join us this evening for a live in conversation event with Lord Waldegrave, who will be in conversation with Alastair Niven. During the event, you may have some questions. If you do, please do use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen to put them, and we will come back to them towards the end of the talk and try and answer them. Thank you very much, and I will hand over to Alastair.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in this series of conversations with interesting people, as I put it. I'm really delighted tonight that we've got Lord Waldegrave with us, who is somebody I've known for several years, but thought would be absolutely ideal for this series because of the range of his interests and his extraordinary background and successes in public office. So I'm going to embarrass him by introducing him with some highlights of his life, simply because many of you who are tuning in from different places, including from outside the United Kingdom, may not be as familiar as people of my generation are with Lord Waldegrave. He is actually, although I refer to him as William Waldegrave, Lord Waldegrave of North Hill and of Chewton Mendip in the county of Somerset. He was educated at Eton College, Oxford University and Harvard, and after a preliminary career doing various things, he worked his way up in politics, becoming a Member of Parliament in 1979 and was in Parliament until 1997 as a Conservative Member of Parliament for Bristol West. He became Lord Waldegrave in 1999, but that was partly in recognition of the many ministerial roles he had had. He had ministerial positions in the environment, in housing and planning, in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He was Secretary of State for Health, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He might like to explain at some point what that role actually is. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster sounds very regional, but is actually very national. Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. It's a most imposing track record, and he held all offices with distinction, though not without controversy, as we may come to. He holds and has held many business directorships, and his voluntary commitments have included being chairman of the Royal Mint Advisory Committee, chairman of the Henry Southern Company, which is very famous among antiquarian booksellers. He's a trustee of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, and he's currently Chancellor of Reading University. He was for several years trustee of Cumberland Lodge in Windsor, where I had a professional connection with him. And since 2009, he has been Provost of Eton College, a title and role which I'm going to ask him later to explain. He's also an author, has written a very distinguished, a really excellent read, memoir called A Different Kind of Weather. So there are so many things that I could address, and in the short time available, we can only look at highlights of that career and of his vision for where we're all going now, particularly in educational terms. So, William, if I may call you that during the course of this interview, or conversation rather, I wondered first if you could let us know, since most of the people listening are members of the English-speaking Union, if you've had any contact with the ESU over this long career.
Oh, yes. I remember a good many functions in these London headquarters, meetings of various kinds. And I remember the immense prestige of the, I don't know whether it still goes on, the English-speaking Union debating tours that they used to send to the United States from the UK, which my late, much lamented friend Edward Mortimer started his career that ended up in a distinguished post at the United Nations on one of those tours. And I'm not sure Chris Patton didn't also, another friend of mine. So the ESU has always been a very luminous and presence in the background of my life. Though I've never been an officer of it in the UK or had any responsibility for its admirable activities, but I'm well aware of it and admire it very much.
Well, just very briefly, the connection between Britain and the United States through the English-speaking Union is a very central matter. I've just seen flashed on the screen Jane Easton, who heads the English-speaking Union now, has said yes, the US debating tours still happen. There are all sorts of links, and of course, in the end, Britain and America are both about promoting the English language, and that's what the ESU centrally does. So that's great. Now, I wanted to look at your very early life, really. You could you not have remained in Somerset as a kind of country squire and spent your whole life farming and maybe running shoots and having a very idyllic rural existence, and yet you chose to enter public life? Was this something you consciously debated with yourself?
It's even more traditional than that. I couldn't have chosen that, really, because I am the younger son in a patriarchal system where the property in the estate, which was given to my family by Mary Tudor, because my family were determined Catholics until the beginning of the 18th century. We went into exile with King James II. My elder brother inherited the land and most of the farms and the pictures and so on. So the tradition was that the younger son had to go out with the blessing of his father, do better than the younger son in the story of the Good Samaritan, and earn his own way. So that was more the tradition I was brought up in, though it's far from an unprivileged background, obviously. But it's an interesting story about which many a novelist in the 19th century particularly has written, the effect on somebody of being brought up surrounded by lovely things, knowing that you weren't going to inherit any of them. Now, my parents were more modern than that and gave my 5 sisters and gave me the best help they could. But my elder brother is the old Waldegrave, and he is the, I don't know that he'd be happy to be described as a country squire, but he lives on and farms on the estate. Now, my father did leave me a tenant farm, a business, which I still, with my wife and son, we are organic dairy farmers on the bleak top of Mendip. And that gives me a route there. And because I was Member of Parliament in Bristol, very near where I was born, 15 miles from where I was born, my constituents allowed me to go on living where I was born. And so we have a farmhouse there, but I am not the estate owner. I'm only the younger son, the chap who has to go out to the outside world.
Well, we've read all about this kind of system in Jane Austen, of course, but the younger son very often becomes a curate. Were you was there any possibility you might have done that, go into the church or do something along those lines?
There were plenty in my family who went down that route. A rather famous in the evangelical wing of the Church of England, Bishop Sam Waldegrave, Bishop of Carlisle, who built many new chapels all over the diocese, which I'm not sure are very helpful to the modern diocese, and lived in the wonderful Rose Castle, which was but in spite of being quite and his writings, he was like I am. He was also a fellow of All Souls and gave the Bampton lectures, the distinguished lecture series on theology. His are on millenarianism. I own a copy, which was released from the library of Oriel College, Oxford. And I bought it, they must have released it after, I suppose, the lectures were delivered in 1840, something like that. I don't know when they released it, but when I bought it in the 1980s, the book was still unopened. That is, the pages hadn't been cut. So nobody, I'm afraid, had ever read it in Oriel College.
Well, the mention of All Souls and Oriel College, and I mentioned Harvard and of course Oxford generally, suggested an alternative career for you might have been an academic one. You have a reputation for being, if I may put it unpatronizingly, one of the more intellectual and more, frankly, more intelligent members in politics. And were you tempted, therefore, to become an academic?
Well, yeah, yes and no. I love All Souls. All Souls has this unique examination fellowship, prize fellowship, where after 2 years, you're given 7 years initially, which can be renewed under certain circumstances, as mine was, luckily for me. And after 2 years, you have to decide whether you're going to be an Oxford Fellow and become a professional academic, or whether you're going to be a London Fellow. London, rather charmingly, it was assumed that anything else you did happened in London. But as a matter of fact, non-academic fellows spread themselves in all directions. And I was tempted, but my subject at that time was political philosophy, and without sounding too pompous about it, I once got into trouble, as I have many times with journalists, for saying this to a journalist, and was ticked off for being incredibly grand and pompous. I came to the conclusion fairly early on that my hero, that I was not ever going to produce anything genuinely original. I wasn't by temperament likely, I thought, to be a very good teacher, because not everyone has to produce original work. The most valuable people in any university are in many ways the people who devote themselves to teaching. I didn't think I would be a very good teacher, unlike my elder daughter, who is a very good teacher. But I'd always actually hankered after politics, even at school a bit. I'd greatly admired Harold Macmillan. My heroes were people like Ian MacLeod and Ted Heath, the modernizers in the Tory party in the 60s. And so, although I was tempted for a moment, I sort of thought I'd better actually go the other way, because I wasn't really cut out to be a very good Don, I don't think.
Well, I was very pleased, just as an aside, that you commented then that very key to being a good academic is to be a good teacher, because there's so much emphasis these days on publish, and research evaluations and so on. But at the end of the day, the best university colleagues I ever had, and I was a university teacher for a number of years, were those who were simply very good with the students and good in the classroom.
I quite agree with you. I strongly agree with that.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be taught philosophy. I did the old course of Mods and Greats, Literae Humanioris, philosophy and classics, because I was interested fundamentally in philosophy, which in the old days meant Aristotle and Plato is where you started in the Western tradition. And I was coming rather, even then, at the end, in this late 60s, of the time when the very best philosophers, Gilbert Ryle and my own tutor Jim Urmson and Strawson and people like that, also put a huge effort into teaching. And yes. The system has sort of diverted them away from that, which is a great pity, I think.
Yeah, well, we could go up that path, it's so true. But coming into politics, did you stand anywhere else before you were elected for Bristol West in 1979? Or was that your first?
No, I put in for other seats. I put in for the I division of Suffolk, and my family originally comes from that part of the world. Right. And so I made a great spiel about how I knew all about Suffolk because my ancestors lived there and so on and so forth. And they listened to this, the committee, with patience, and selected John Selwyn Gummer. And I was then selected for Bristol West, which was much nearer my home, by a bit of luck. And as just to say that the Conservative Party, which is not used to have a reputation for being very efficient, is not always efficient, because my first meeting in Bristol West to the Conservative Association, the chairman read out a piece about how my heart lay in Suffolk, and Suffolk was the place I really wanted to be, because he got a slightly out-of-date brief. But anyway, I was lucky to be selected in Bristol, where I was near my original, where I lived and where I could go on living.
And I've noticed, sort of looking at your CV, that your commitment to Bristol to remain constant. You were particularly involved with Bristol Cathedral.
I was the first chair of their new Bristol Cathedral Trust. We were rather controversial because we got the local nuclear power station to adopt the choir. But as a matter of fact, I've always been greatly in favor of civil nuclear power as part of the solution to our energy problems, even more important now, I think, not necessarily the whole solution, but part. But it was a little controversial, but they were, in my view, a respectable company. And that often overlooked cathedral is a fascinating one, which is always worth the visit. It's not Bath and Wells and slightly overshadow it in the neighborhood, but it's a very interesting and beautiful cathedral.
Well, I hope some of the young members of the ESU who are watching and who are perhaps fairly, in some cases, new to this country will make a pilgrimage to Bristol Cathedral. And it's got some very fine churches in addition to that.
Oh, wonderful old city churches, you're quite right.
Queen Elizabeth I said that the famous church there was the finest parish church in England.
St. Mary Redcliffe, the finest church in all my realm, where I had the privilege of reading the Christmas lesson one year, and that was a wonderful moment.
There we are. But let's move away from the regions into the centre of power, which is in Downing Street, of course, and you fairly quickly ascended to ministerial office, Secretary of State roles, and then full ministerial roles, and you were very much involved with two of the key political figures of modern times, who those of a certain age will certainly remember as very powerful people, Margaret Thatcher and John Major, working with two such distinguished people, one of whom is still obviously very active and pronounced on the present government only 2 days ago, must have been a very exciting business. I'm trying really to tempt you to say a little bit about your friendship and relationship with Margaret Thatcher first.
I think it would be pretentious of me to describe myself as a friend, because I was a younger generation than her. I was seen at the time as being on the other wing of the party. I'd been the political secretary to Mr. Heath, whom she had displaced. And the jargon of the day was that if you weren't a full-blown Thatcherite, you were a wet. Now, I was slightly betwixt and between, because I did believe that the British economy needed a jolt and needed a re-injection of what Keynes called the animal spirits of free enterprise to get it going again. And I believe she did the right things in that respect. And I believe that in standing up to the Soviet Union, we now don't think of it in the past as being very dangerous, but it was dangerous, and it had its friends in this country who were dangerous. In all that, I thoroughly supported her, and in her belief in freedom, which was very powerful towards the end of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, where she was a great hero. Where I differed from her was that I thought it was odd that you believed in personal freedom in economic matters, but in a rather constricted approach to people's liberties when it came to many social matters. I couldn't see why you had to be on the right, or the old-fashioned, perhaps right's unfair. Right-left gets rather confused here, but you had to be a social sort of conservative with a small c, and a libertarian and progressive on economic matters. So I was more liberal than she was on social matters. This sometimes got me into trouble with her, but she never... She gave me a job early on. She stood by me when I made various mistakes. And I came to admire her greatly. I think, like everybody every major figure, in my view, will do some things that offend somebody. But I think she did what was necessary at the time. And then she went on a bit too long, as successful leaders nearly always do. But the result of that was that she was succeeded by somebody completely different, a much more consensual and socially liberal person in John Major. But he consolidated in a way, by winning that 1992 election, the underlying structure that she had put in place, which was then accepted by Mr. Blair and Gordon Brown, so that there was then a wonderful period of continuity in the fundamental underlying approach from about 1992 right up until quite modern times, until 2010 or something, when the spectre of Europe came and split up the consensus that it existed. And looking back in it, I think that period, both under John Major and under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, was rather a good period in British history, we will come to see, although of course there were things that should be undone and things that were mistakes.
I'm very attracted, excuse me, I'm very attracted at that idea of continuity between the three of them, because that continuity seems to have been fractured today with so much kind of discontent and alienation in society, and people sort of one against the other and so on. If we can stay with Thatcher for a moment, she was such a towering political presence and became a kind of byword for strength. And there is no alternative, the lady's not for turning and all the rest of it. But I've heard many anecdotes over the years from people who worked with her and knew her, where a much softer side was demonstrated, concern for the cleaning lady's daughter who'd been in a road accident and things like that. Would you say that was true?
Absolutely true. But it's more fun. That's a very fundamental point, that she was personally very kindly to people, often surprising people, and maintained friendships across the political spectrum, which would surprise people. She remained in touch to the dying day with Dorothy Hodgkin, her tutor at Oxford, who was a formidable Nobel Prize winning scientist, but of the left. But they respected each other.
Very much so. My first post after Cambridge was in the University of Ghana, and Dorothy Hodgkin's husband was the director of the Institute of African Studies there, and Dorothy Hodgkin used to come out, and they were really great admirers of Kwame Nkrumah, who of course was a socialist leader.
Right. Well, Mrs. Thatcher would have been a great opponent of Nkrumah's, I've no doubt, but she had friendships across the political spectrum. She respected ability wherever it came from. And in personal terms, she was often exceedingly kind, as you say. She was also far more cautious than she was not nearly so much of a Thatcherite as her sort of acolytes nowadays believe. And I often hear people saying, oh, Thatcher would have done this, Thatcher would have done that. And I often think, you didn't work for her. She was more cautious. She was more careful. Her rhetoric often ran ahead of what she actually did. One example I would just give is that she greatly respected the civil service. She was a punctilious maintainer of the tradition of a first-rate, apolitical civil service. And she got on very well with her top civil servants, always. She always used to bellyache about the Foreign Office, as lots of people do. But one of her closest advisors was a through and through Foreign Office man, Charles Powell, who was perhaps her closest friend at the end.
That's very interesting. I'm going to ask you whether you think she played on her gender. I ask this because she once gave my father a lift home when she was not well known. She was just at the beginning of her political career, and he'd given a lecture on something or other, and she gave him a lift home, and they remained, I can remember this, I was a teenager, my father and she remained outside in the car, her car, chatting, and my mother kept peeping out and saying, I don't know what's keeping your father, and finally she kind of exploded and said, your father's been 45 minutes in that car with a blonde. And it was as though he picked someone up, and she was outraged. And in fact, of course, the blonde became Prime Minister, which I don't think either of them anticipated quite then, but he remained an admirer of her all her life, a devotee. And I wonder whether she had a way of captivating men in particular. She had a largely male cabinet.
Well, she was extremely sensitive to being patronized by old-fashioned males. But extremely also aware of using her, most famously, her flirtations with President Mitterrand, who used to flirt with her back. And they were chalk and cheese in every way. And they used to, she was not above using those wiles, but I've often heard her tease an audience by saying how proud she was to be the first, scientist to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And in a real sense, I think she was equally proud of that. Of course, she was proud of being the first woman. And she was, in the way of some you can read about this in other people's biographies. She wasn't a sort of active promoter of other women because she thought, I think, if I can get there, anyone can get there. And you don't need any help. I've been through it, so you've got to go through it. A bit of an old-fashioned attitude in a way, but nonetheless, she broke through so many barriers in her life.
You gave a very good summary of your view of John Major, so we don't necessarily need to revisit that, except he pops up from time to time as a critic of the present government, the present Prime Minister, and without drawing you back into politics, I wonder whether you think this is something that an ex-Prime Minister should do, or would it be better if he just gritted his teeth and remained quiet?
I think there are issues and issues on this. I think it's bad. I was often asked when, I don't know, in the last pandemic and so on, I would regularly be rung up by journalists asking me to make critical remarks about Matt Hancock or one of my successors as Secretary of State for Health over the years. And I would never do that. I know what a terrible job that is. I mean, wonderful, but terrible, difficult. And I think that's wrong. But I think that ex-prime ministers in particular, but other senior politicians who are still active, do have a constitutional role in defense of what they see as the Constitution. That I don't think anybody thought it odd of people to campaign on one side or the other of the European referendum, which was a constitutional issue. And in relation to standards of behavior and so forth, though remembering at all times the good biblical text, and let him who is without sin cast the first stone. We have to be careful, we people who've been through it all, not to get ourselves on a high horse, which we can easily fall off. I do think that there is, particularly in Britain, where there's an unwritten constitution, a role for senior people, an important role in saying, look, the conventions that on which we rest for the working of our constitution are not being respected.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I was reminded of you, if I may say it, William, in the last week or so, Owen Paterson. We needn't go over the whole circumstances, but there can be few people listening in now who aren't aware that in the last few days there's been considerable discussion about the role of a backbench MP, former minister, upon whom an adverse report was made to Parliament, and there appeared to be an attempt by government to bypass that report. I'm not wanting to go into the pros and cons of that. I'm thinking of Mr. Paterson himself. He was at the centre of this storm. You yourself were at the centre of a storm over the Scott report, which was an inquiry into the export of defence equipment to Iraq, a report that was published in 1996. And again, without going into the pros and cons, the rights and wrongs of that report and how you were treated at the time, I just wonder whether you had a fellow feeling with Owen Paterson. I want to know really what it is like personally and emotionally to be assaulted on all sides by the press, by the media, by the public, no doubt, who write in. It must be a very difficult experience, which most of us listening tonight won't have to hopefully undergo.
I hope you never do. It's very much worse now than it was in my day, because social media magnifies everything 100-fold, I think. But it is horrible. It was bad enough in my time. And when you have children and family, it is awful being at you cannot quite imagine what it's like being at the center of one of those storms unless you've been in it yourself.
That's what I'm really asking. It must be awful. Yeah.
And I cannot imagine what Paterson's going through, having had his wife's suicide and so on. So what their children must be going through. And the public tends to say, well, nobody told you to go into politics. You can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. That's fine, that saying, as long as the people who say that, never get the heat themselves. I was listening with sympathy this morning on Radio 4 the Today program to the husband of that poor murdered Labour MP. And he was saying that there should be some system to protect the victims and their families of when they've been struck by terrorism and so on. I totally sympathize with that. Anybody who's been in one of those situations, anyone who's had or known people who have been at the center of some storm like that, they begin to get an inkling of it. But when you live with it for week after week after week after week, you either have to have a hide like a rhinoceros, and do we really want politicians who have hides like rhinoceroses who can't feel anything at all? Or you get affected by it. If I hadn't had a wonderfully supportive family, and if my children hadn't been, luckily, my eldest daughter was born in 1980, so she got some of it. She was 16, 15, 16, 17. And the school she was at, St. Paul's Girls' School, were very careful to protect her as much as they could. But even so, you know, there was a comedian, not a very funny comedian in my view, who parked a cardboard tank outside our house, which delighted my 5-year-old son. But what did it mean? Of course, there were no British tanks in Iraq. The Iraqi tanks were all Chinese and Russian and so on. But it gets through. And when I just, by a bit of luck, escaped being blown up by the IRA on another occasion, a slightly different thing, the pressure on one's children from sometimes well-meaning, sometimes not well-meaning people who say, "Oh, was it your dad that was nearly killed the other day?" What do they think they're doing when they ask a question like that to a child? So unless you've been in it, you can't really imagine it, and it's not very nice.
Well, I suppose you were referring to Brendan Cox and Jo Cox's murder.
Yeah.
Her sister, of course, was elected MP herself later, and has said recently, after the death of a Conservative MP who was murdered recently, that she was really tempted just to walk out on politics because the strain was insufferable.
I don't blame her at all. There is a non-trivial number of democratic politicians in Western Europe who have been killed since the war, in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Britain. Sweden, of course. Sweden, absolutely, Sweden, yeah, and others.
Yeah. Well, I think we should move on to a more cheerful topic, but I do just want to ask on that line whether you're still haunted after more than 20 years by that feeling that you've just described, which was so powerful in the mid-90s. Is it something that's still...
Yes, I mean, I know what my obituaries will start with. They'll start with the Scott inquiry. When I wrote my memoir, I originally wrote three spoof obituaries to be put at the end of it, which I thought, but that my daughter persuaded me that was too macabre. I wrote one sort of favourable, which I put in the Times, one very hostile, which I put in the Guardian, and one from the Western Daily Press saying, "Shoot and mend it man, misspelt dies."
Aberdeen man lost at sea.
That's right, yes. But probably rightly, my wife and daughter said they were self-indulgent and macabre, so I didn't put them in the text.
Well, I hope you didn't destroy them. I'd love to read them. But I'm going to move on. A friend told me that he had asked you during your ministerial period whether you would ever be Prime Minister, and this friend believed that you might well be at the time. And your reply, he quotes, is that the last thing they will do is have another old Etonian as Prime Minister. I don't know if you recall whether that was the standard answer you gave to people in the mid-90s. But, well, you were proved wrong, of course, because David Cameron and Boris Johnson, both old Etonians. Are you surprised at the way that Eton's influence, which is, of course, historically enormous over British politics, has continued to this day?
Well, I campaigned for Douglas Hurd to be Prime Minister against John Major, actually. So I thought he would have been a very good Prime Minister. who's an old Etonian as well. But so I'm very surprised. I don't think the institution can claim the credit or the demerit, because we produce such a range of people that what it reflects is that there is still a too narrow entry route into politics for too many people. And some of the old ladders have gone away. I don't want to get into a dispute about the grammar schools, but when I arrived in Oxford in 1965, the university was dominated by state school people because they come from the great grammar schools. And the public school boys and girls all pretended to have come from grammar schools, more or less convincingly, and kept our heads down rather. And it sort of went backwards after that somehow. I don't quite know why. And now it's going in the right direction again. Now, but Eton has a much wider range of people in its entry than people often understand, because we have about 100 people on 100% bursaries and lots more on partial bursaries, so that quite a number of the people who then get into prominent positions have used Eton rather like the old grammar schools we used in that sense. And they're able people who've won bursaries and scholarships yet. Others are not. Others come from the traditional background, and it's partly that part of British society still has more than its fair share of the top jobs, and Eton has more than its fair share of the best. I'm slightly putting in inverted commas, candidates from that narrow segment. If you see what I mean. But I don't think it's exactly Eton's fault. Though there is something that worries me about, and it goes back much further than, I wrote a little bit about this in my book, the culture of glittering prizes associated with the Edwardians, really, people like F.E. Smith and Churchill himself, who went up the ladder winning prizes without necessarily Disraeli in the 19th century. A culture where you get to the top of the greasy pole, but you're not quite sure what it's for when you've got there. And I think that there is a little bit too much of that in the British culture in general, actually. And I think Eton must watch out that it doesn't have too much of that. But I do emphasize that there are lots of other Etonians who do things quite differently. The captain of the school when I was there, called Francis Prideaux, who moved to the right at the end of his life and worked for Tony Benn, but most of his life spent working in the Socialist Workers' Party. So there's a good old range here, and I'm surprised that we've had 2 prime ministers since 2010, and so is everybody else, I think, rather.
Talking more widely about sort of education, secondary education, I chaired, some years ago, I chaired Lord Adonis at a meeting in Windsor, and he spoke very interestingly. He was, of course, an advisor to the Tony Blair government on educational issues, and he spoke very interestingly about aspirations so that working class kids and so on could get a better deal. And at one point in his talk, he said, "I'd like every school to be like the one down the road," and he pointed vaguely in the direction of Eton College. And I was chairing this and supposed to be completely neutral, but I kind of was exasperated because I'd been round. Eric Anderson, your predecessor, used to have me into Eton, and I've seen a wonderful collection of books and manuscripts, Gray's Elegy, the original of it, the paintings. As you know, it is a school that has been bequeathed so much that other schools in the country could never possibly aspire to. So I thought, this is a bit of flannel, isn't it? I'd like every school to be like the one down the road, because they could never be like Eton. And that's not Eton's fault, of course. But is there a kind of unreality about a lot of people when they talk about aspirations in education?
Well, the present headmaster and I, Simon Henderson and I, have been really thinking about this in recent years. And we think that although, of course, it's ridiculous to think that the extra sort of the extra privilege that comes with being in these beautiful buildings surrounded by museums and libraries that would do very well at an Oxford or Cambridge college. You can't spread that, but is there something that we're good at in this school that we could spread more widely? And we've concluded that there is, that we do know about a certain kind of excellent academic teaching, and we jolly well ought to with all those resources, and that is, if you like, bottleable and spreadable. And we are about to launch, we hope, if the government goes on with the free school programs, and I strongly approve of Andrew Adonis's part in the birth of all that. And there's been a good bipartisan underpinning in that aspect of our education policy for the last 20 years. And we want to having done some good work in the East End of London with some other schools at the London Academy of Excellence, and having done a boarding academy at Holyport near Maidenhead, which you know, which is the first new state boarding school, we think we should now take this resource from here and spread it more widely, because we can bring people to Eton, and we do, and we've doubled the spend on bursaries to enable access here, but that's very expensive and still provides, now, if you take equivalent amounts of money, and Andrew would agree with me on this, I think, and spread it by sponsoring schools in other parts of the country, trying to work with people there who want what we can offer, and don't think we've got the answer to everything. We know nothing about how to run a great city centre co-ed comprehensive school, but we do know something about how to prepare academically able children for the best universities in the world. And we are proposing to launch what we hope will be 3 new free schools doing that in the Midlands and the north of England, because that part of it is spreadable. Now, people will say, well, that's just what the old grammar schools did. Well, yes and no. If you're an alliance, we'd never go anywhere where we weren't welcomed. But it's for the relatively small number of people who the schools themselves know we'd like a bit of extra help for that one. If you can do it cooperatively in regions of real deprivation, I think we have got something to add, which would then sort of change the nature, rather, of the educational charity we are. I don't think we should just defend our educational charity only by bursaries. We should defend it by trying to spread what we're good at more widely.
Well, I think that's a really visionary statement you just made, and if I may say it, I think you put it more clearly. I think Andrew Adonis was probably reaching for what you just described, and it was, of course, at an earlier stage as well, a few years ago. But what you've just said is to me, anyway, very persuasive. So thank you. I wonder if I can ask you just 3 sort of quick practical questions about Eton. First of all, the Provost. You referred to the headmaster. You're not the headmaster of Eton. Eton almost uniquely has a Provost. What does Provost do?
Provost, Norman French for praepositor, Norman French version of praepositus, Latin word, somebody put it in charge. We are a good old medieval foundation. We used to have 12 fellows, all resident here. We were, Henry VI, our founder, wanted us to be the greatest oratory in the country. His enormous chapel that we have was just the choir of the great church he was going to build as the pilgrimage center of England. We were going to have a school, an almshouse, and we were going to pray. We were a Marian foundation, and still are. And we still have the Blessed Virgin on Lupton's Tower, and wearing her blue robe. And so we had a typical little medieval foundation, like an Oxford or Cambridge College or a smaller version of those. And there used to be 12 resident fellows. There are now only 10. But I have a provost and vice provost. And what effectively I do is that I try to take as much as I can of the administrative burden for running a big and complex school, and now these wider things we're doing, off the headmaster, so that he can be a school teacher, which is what drove him into the profession in the first place, rather than being an administrator. And how often have I heard good teachers saying, nowadays I have to spend so much time in administration? Well, the purpose of my role, apart from being a bit of an outward ambassador, I hope, is to take as much as I can off his back and let him get on with doing what he is good at.
And two just very quick questions. I'm sure you can answer with it in a one-liner. Do you have any plans to admit girls? And if so, if you haven't, why not?
No, we don't have any such plans. Partly because we are still overwhelmed with demand for what we've got. If we weren't in a floodplain and an area of outstanding natural beauty and all the rest of it, and could just build some more houses, I think I might argue to the fellows, let's build some more houses and go co-ed. But I would only do it if we did it properly, 50-50. We experimented with bringing girls into the sixth form, and we came to the conclusion, I don't know what others think, that really didn't work. So we'd have to do it properly. And we'd have to do it properly by turning away half the boys. And I have more pressure from people who are turned down getting in now. So that's a roundabout way of saying we'd rather like to do it if it was doable, but we have no plans in the foreseeable future because we have to fight away the demand for what we've got.
A lot of independent and public schools have opened overseas versions of themselves all around the world, particularly in places like Malaysia and China and so on. I remember your predecessor saying that he thought the Eton brand was indivisible, and therefore there were no plans to open an Eton college in Kuala Lumpur or something like that. Is that still the case? And
yes, that's very much still the case. I think it would be very odd for a well-endowed British educational charity to spend its efforts on educating the elite in China. Now, they do it to try and, some people try to do it to make money, but you can't do it, and you would have to have complete control over curriculum and teaching and all the rest of it, and that is very unlikely to be available. But more important than that, I'd like to put our efforts here. We are a British institution, and we should go back to Henry VI. We've changed the statute now, but I used to have to sign a piece of paper every time we gave a scholarship to a person who didn't come from King Henry VI's realms, which meant England and France, because France he regarded himself as the king of. Of course, we welcome foreign students. We don't have a huge number, but we welcome them because they leaven the cake like anything. But our heart is here, and I think if we've got anything to offer, we should offer it to the British educational system.
William, I'm going to open this up for any questions that people might want to ask, but just while people are mulling that over and perhaps putting some questions in the chat box, I want to ask more generally about your view of the prospects for the people that you're teaching who are perhaps coming to the end of their time at Eton and will go out into the wider world, a very difficult and complex world. Are you optimistic about the opportunities they face, or do you think that the millstones of student debt, the uncertainties of employment, climate change, the perilous world that they face, that although your professional job is to be optimistic, in your heart, are you optimistic for the young generation? Well,
I'm optimistic in the sense that the overwhelming challenge that I have 7 grandchildren, that the teenagers at the school and my grandchildren coming along behind them, the overwhelming challenge they face is about global warming and the huge adjustments we've got to make. Now, I am optimistic only in the sense that I think the capacity of the human spirit to face adversity when it finally comes to grips with it is very much greater than one often predicts. And the resources and the science are available to do it. The numbers always sound enormous, but that's like saying, if you had said in 1900 that there are going to be cities of tens of millions of people all over the globe, think how much you will have to spend on the sewage and the water. It's billions, you'll never be able to afford it. Well, they did afford it, they have to afford it. So we're going to have to afford redoing, if to use my analogy, the plumbing and the infrastructure of the world to live with, to take us through climate change. Now, that's a challenge which is going to throw up new heroes and new problems and new villains too, probably, but it's a doable thing. I would only be pessimistic if I thought, it wasn't doable. I think the scientists and the engineers, it's engineers actually we almost need now, because we know the science, can do it. And the difficult part is, as always, bringing to people like you and me, and I'm just the same as everybody else in this, that we've got to change what we're doing now because of things we can't immediately see. It's the same old battle. The Archbishop got into trouble with this analogy the other day, so I'll try and speak more carefully. But it's the same old thing as it was in the 1930s with appeasement. You've got to get people to spend money and do unwelcome things now in order to stave off, you hope, something much worse if you don't. And we didn't do it then. And we've got to do it now, and I think we can. So it's nip and tuck, and it may go wrong, but it's doable.
That's an encouraging, if qualified, answer. It's very kind. Thank you very much. Rachel Fernandez at the ESU is kind of masterminding the question session now. So I'm going to ask Rachel if we could have a first question. Have you been put some questions, please?
Hello, hi. So the first question we have is the person, thanks you for the very interesting talk. And they wonder what advice you could give to a young person who would like to engage with politics today.
Well, I always, whenever I go to a sixth form and talk to school, which I still do sometimes, and not as much as when I was a politician, I always emphasize to people that it's no good sitting on the sidelines and belly aching. It's a voluntary system. And if you don't like the politicians we've got, then the best thing to do is to join in at local level, at any level. The warning I would give is the one that we discussed earlier, that it's become a very savage world, and you've got to be sure that you want to do it and that you know the risks. And preferably, if you're of the age where you've just got married or something, or thinking of getting a partner of some kind, make sure that your partner knows what you want to do. I can't think of anything worse than becoming the partner of someone you think is going to be a philosophy don in Oxford, and then find that you're the husband or the spouse of a person who is ended up in this maelstrom. I couldn't have done it without a family who sort of supported me and kept me sane, reasonably sane. That's for you to judge. And I think that the first thing to do would be to get yourself clear in your own mind about who you are and why you're doing it, so that when the unfairnesses, and there will be unfairnesses and savagery come, you've got some quiet place to go, which probably means with your partner, where you can feel safe. Then you'll be okay. But don't go into it because it's a sport or a game. It's not.
But the hero or heroine in these circumstances is very often the partner. I would acknowledge that in my own life. And your own wife, Caroline, is an extremely distinguished person in her own right, in a completely different walk of life, cuisine and so on. So I like the fact that you have acknowledged that implicitly.
And I think I would also say to the young person, get some hinterland. Don't do nothing but politics before you go into politics. Learn about something else, not because you're learning because you want to sort of do a prince's education and use it, but have something so that if things go wrong, which they will in politics, you can feel, oh, well, I'll go back and write that book about Alexander the Great, or I will go and do that farming that I really should have done all along, or whatever it was. You've got to have, it's not got to be the only thing in the world, because if it is, well, Abby-Gerald Enoch Powell said, all political careers end in failure. And I know what he meant. So that if that's all you've got, you will have a sad end.
We seem to have lost the generation of politicians that wrote and read. Perhaps they still are reading a lot, but the sort of famous remark that your hero Harold Macmillan made, that he never went to bed without a trollope beside him, I think is he was of course referring to the novelist, is somehow a remark you can't imagine any contemporary minister making. Anyway, another question, Rachel. Rachel?
Hello, sorry. The next question is, most Etonians, indeed, privately educated children, have much self-confidence and the ability to communicate. In the ESU, we have a focus on oracy to try and level this playing field in the public sector. We feel we're right in the right. So do you think that this is the right direction to travel in?
I certainly do. And that's one of the things that we try and do in our partnerships with schools. And is to say, look, your teachers know far more about a whole range of things and your needs than we do. But there are certain things that we do think we know. And actually debating and expression of views and argument is one of the things that we think we're quite good at here. So we're in exactly the same territory as you on that. And my goodness, you know, when you think, Harold Macmillan told me, I sat at his feet when he was an old man, that the greatest orator he'd ever heard was not Churchill, but was actually Lloyd George, who didn't come from he came from a middle-class background, but not a sort of great public school background. And amongst the great orators who I've listened to, well, you know, on the international stage, there was nothing more powerful than a speech by Nelson Mandela. So the capacity to express important things clearly can come from many different backgrounds, but it's worth trying to teach people. The ancient world and the medieval world who taught rhetoric were not on the wrong track. Nor was the...
You mentioned Mandela. I want to slip in a little question. Mandela Rhodes Foundation, of which you've been a trustee. What is your view about the tearing down of Rhodes statues and the whole argument really about the rewriting of history through the changing of the imagery surrounding us?
I would leave the old monster up there. It's a ridiculous statue. He placed himself above, I think, the four evangelists who were below him on the wall. If you wanted a caricature of Rhodes to remind you of that, though he was a genius in some ways at his business, a ruthless genius, he is a flawed hero. Nobody thinks that he was a hero as an overall moral man. I was just looking, I took down from my shelf one of my childhood books that used to give me nightmares, powerful book, C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, the other day, and it fell open at the page where one of the heroes is saying that there is a range from saints on the one hand to Cecil Rhodes on the other. That was published in 1945. So the idea that we've just noticed that Cecil Rhodes was a bad man is not right. He was highly controversial then, he remains highly controversial. His scholarships, which have transcended his name, are a wonderful thing. And they should be celebrated. That's why we set up the Mandela Rhodes Foundation. When his centenary came, we chose to celebrate not the centenary of his death, but the centenary of the next year of the publication of his will. And we took a significant part of the endowment back to South Africa, where the money had been made. And we looked for a partner, and by a series of events which I needn't trouble you with, Mr. Mandela himself said, I will be your partner, and we will call this the Mandela Rhodes Foundation. And he knew exactly what he was doing. He was offending quite a range of people, both on the left and the right, by linking his name with Cecil Rhodes. And we've got a picture of him in front of a glowering portrait of Cecil Rhodes in in our office in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela is wagging his finger at the portrait and saying, "Cecil, you and I are going to work together." And
Well,
he took the money to build his new South Africa, and that was right, in my view.
that's a great story, and I've always been puzzled by the linking of Mandela Rhodes in the foundation. You've explained it. Can I ask if there's one last question, because we must keep an eye on the time? Rachel, any question pending?
No, I think there are no more questions.
Well, I just want to end by asking you a personal question, William. Do you plan to write more? You wrote a really good memoir, and I feel there must be more writing in you. So can we expect a second book, a third book, I think it would be?
Yes, I wrote a little book about why I think we haven't yet figured out what we're doing post-Brexit, and we don't realize quite how it unraveled the whole post-war establishment. Whether you think it's right or whether you think it's wrong, we haven't yet produced a new vision for what Britain is about. I wrote in a little sort of pamphletty book. Yes, I'd love to write another book. Of course, like everybody, all lunatics in the world, especially people like me, think they've got a novel in them somewhere. We are the despair of publishers who have piles of hopeless manuscripts of novels from people like me, used as doorstops and things for keeping out the drama.
Have you actually written this?
No, but any moment I'm going to send it round, and it'll be turned down, I promise you. So you'll never read it.
May not be. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation from my point of view anyway, because you've made it very easy. The questions I put to you, you've answered fully and amusingly and very thoughtfully. And I think anyone listening would feel that Eton's in excellent hands, because you have a vision for the college, but you have a vision really for the country in which the college plays a leading part. So it's been really fascinating, and I'm extremely grateful to you, William, for this. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone who's been listening in. I should say this has been recorded, and we make available the recording. So although only a finite number of people listen tonight, it will be made available elsewhere, and there will be people in branches of the English-speaking Union who couldn't tune in tonight because of unsympathetic timings and things like that in Australia and elsewhere, who I'm sure will be listening to this, and probably for quite some time to come. So although I can't ask an audience, as they would normally do, to clap, I think I would just ask everyone to somehow emanate their support and applause for William Waldegrave tonight, for a really terrific evening. I'm very grateful to you.
Well, it's always a delight, Alastair, to talk to you. And I always admired so much the work you did at Cumberland Lodge too.
Well, that's very kind. I've just noticed flashed on the screen something that speaks for everyone. It's been a privilege to listen to you, and and somebody else has just put thanks, clap, clap. So there we are. Those messages are coming in. Can I just, for the benefit of our members, say that the next two conversations are now arranged. The next one will actually be on the 29th of November. I think that's Monday. And the speaker will be Matthew Rycroft, who is the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, one of the top civil servants in the country, and possibly the most difficult of all ministries, involved with immigration and so many other issues, crime, and so on. So Matthew Rycroft, we're really delighted, is going to be the subject to the next conversation. And then in the new year, on the 11th of January, which I think is Tuesday, Dame Sarah Thornton, who is the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. Modern slavery, of course, is a blight on many countries, including this one. So she will be talking, obviously, a little bit retrospectively about slavery of the time we think of in the plantations and so on. But she'll be primarily talking with me about modern day slavery and how active and unfortunately real it is. That's on the 11th of January. But once again, William, thanks so much for this evening, and I'll drop you a note afterwards, but thank you for everyone at the English-Speaking Union.
Thank you, Alastair. I enjoyed it very much.
Good, thank you. Good night, everyone.